The 8th generation of consoles was definitely a time of remastering for older games. Spyro, Crash, Halo, Medieval, and eventually Ratchet & Clank. Although Ratchet & Clank's 2016 release does share similarities with the original, the end result is more of a reimagining of the original than a remaster or remake when compared to that of, say, Medieval's remaster or Halo Master Chief Collection. Normally, for video game reviews, I like to go in order for the series, but seeing as Rift Apart has shown that the movie tie-in game is more of a spin-off than a reboot, I figured it wouldn't hurt to review Ratchet & Clank 2016, or as it is known as the only Ratchet & Clank game that appeared natively on the PlayStation 4. Ratchet 2016's first signs of life came from early 2013. In April 2013, a teaser for the Ratchet & Clank movie was released online under a simple name of Ratchet & Clank, with Vancouver production company Rainmaker Studios helming the animated movie. The trailer for the movie was also included in the release of that year's Ratchet & Clank game, Into the Nexus, to try and generate hype up for both the last game and the future of the series. Ratchet & Clank was slated to come out originally in 2015, but was pushed back to 2016 with a tie-in video game based on the movie based on the original game being made by Insomniac Games. Ratchet & Clank was released in theaters on April 29, 2016, with the game launching on the PlayStation 4 on April 12, 2016. While the movie failed to make back its budget, earning only $14 million out of its $20 million budget, Ratchet & Clank's 2016 video game would go on to be the best-selling game at launch for the franchise since the PlayStation 2 days. For myself, I was excited for both the movie and the video game, and while I enjoyed both at the time, I will say that the game is definitely more entertaining and enjoyable for me than the movie was. That being said, the game also has a lot of issues that I take with it. Being a massive Ratchet & Clank fan as I am, I bought a PlayStation 4 originally for the eventual game that would come out on the console. Little did I know it would be the only Ratchet & Clank game that would hit the PlayStation 4 after we had so many games on the PlayStation 2 and 3 prior. It was my hope that the game would be a simple retelling of the original Ratchet & Clank game, but with better graphics and better gameplay mechanics. I can definitely say that on a gameplay level, Ratchet & Clank 2016 is one of the best in the series. But story-wise, I have to say it is one of the weakest in the whole franchise. As to rip the proverbial band-aid off, let's get into the story of Ratchet & Clank 2016 to see where a once beautiful and rather hilarious story was watered down to portray a more kid-friendly attitude and market itself towards children more. The game uses full scenes from the movie with some edited scenes as well, so that could be kind of dangerous on YouTube, but I'll try to keep it to a minimum so I can avoid content IDs as much as possible.
You don't have what it takes.
The story of Ratchet & Clank 2016 shares similarities with Ratchet & Clank on a surface level. Ratchet is an orphan living on planet Veldin who wishes to leave his home to find bigger and better things. Clank is a warbot defect who escapes from the factory and crash lands on Veldin after learning what Chairman Alonzo Dreck's plan is. And together they must find Captain Quark to try and stop the plan of Dreck. On paper, Ratchet & Clank 2016 and the original game have the same plot, but it's the inner workings of the plot that show the differences, and that's where I have problems with Ratchet & Clank 2016. It's the inner workings of the plot. Chairman Dreck, for one, isn't creating a new planet for the Blarg to pollute and then continue an endless cycle of capitalistic destruction and corruption, but honestly just wants to make a new home for the Blarg by taking pieces of other planets. Something that the game actually doesn't really portray much at all for whatever reason. It's just sort of glossed over that Dreck's taking parts of other planets. All for the bigger plot, but it still is kind of weird that it's never even addressed. Ratchet is now a young, idealistic adventurer who wishes to join the Galactic Rangers of the Solana Galaxy to prove himself as a hero. Captain Quark is still largely the same, a selfish and boisterous hero who loves the limelight and attention it brings, but also has a cold heart somewhere inside of him. A fun little twist is that the game is narrated by Quark as a story being retold through his eyes after the events of the game had already taken place, but unfortunately the game doesn't actually play itself much into that aside from a few quips from the narrator, who is Captain Quark, from time to time, which I kind of find a shame. I would have loved had the game played more into this is a story motif, so I made up these things. Maybe we could have gotten something similar to Ratchet and Clank Size Matters with the strange mind world. I digress. The main problem I have with Ratchet & Clank 2016's plot, though, comes from the fact that Chairman Drek is played entirely for comedy in the movie and in the game, while the original Drek's comedy came from him being the straight man trying to deal with the imbeciles in his employment. What was once threatening and a power-hungry man who commanded attention in every scene was now reduced to comedic roles that never showed his cunning or ruthlessness. No, that was instead moved over for the new villain added to Ratchet & Clank 2016, Dr. Nefarious. Now, Dr. Nefarious was not a new name to the franchise, but in this version, he was shown to be the mastermind behind the whole plot of Ratchet & Clank 2016. Now, the movie and the video game actually have completely different endings from each other, and how they handle Dr. Nefarious, with one honestly just killing Dr. Nefarious off, and the other one sequel baiting for a later entry that will never come because the game and movie unfortunately didn't impress Sony enough. The universe also in Ratchet & Clank 2016 just feels a lot smaller than it did in the original game, and part of that is due to the fact that in Ratchet & Clank 2016, there are a lot less locations for you to visit than there were inside of the original Ratchet & Clank. When compared to the original Ratchet & Clank, Ratchet 2016 shares many of the same locations as the original game, but they omit a fair number of worlds that were in the original game as well. Gone are the worlds of Eudora, Orxon, Ultanis, Ultanis' Orbit, Hoven, Umbris, sorta, and even Novalis gets taken out of the game near the end of the adventure. That only leaves a handful of planets within the 2016 remake, and even then, those worlds feel much smaller than they once were. Early worlds such as Blackwater City's Rilgar and the construction site on planet Iridia are basically copied straight from the original, but the need to return to the worlds after they're completed are taken out, and thus backtracking is not a necessity in Ratchet & Clank 2016 unless you're going for gold bolts, which can be seen as a good thing to some and not so much a good thing to others. Then you have planets like Planet Quartu, which are completely reworked from the original game and are much smaller in scale and scope. The final level, the Deplanetizer, is a device mentioned in the first game and made into a full level, but even that level is rather short and feels longer than it really is due to the swarms of enemies that are within the area of the game. The side characters of Ratchet 2016 also don't help to bring the game's story up at all, I feel. The Galactic Rangers are very one-note characters who don't get enough screen time to be fleshed out and don't have that many moments with the main characters for me to really remember much about them at all. This holds true for the inhabitants of worlds, if there are any inhabitants of the worlds in the first place. Most of the plot focuses on the Galactic Rangers though, and even then, through the limited interactions, it makes it difficult for me to care about them. So, overall, the plot of Ratchet & Clank 2016 is one of the more weaker aspects of the franchise, which is a shame, especially because I had been so hyped for the game, only for it to really kind of let me down in the story department. But I will say, though, that I would think that if they had gone with the original story and didn't tamper with it, it would resonate a lot more nowadays with players, and would be something a lot of people would enjoy even to this day. But since we're talking about the game, how does the gameplay stack up when compared to the original? Well, that's actually kind of easy for me to get into, so let's start there next. On a gameplay level, I can summarize Ratchet & Clank 2016 with a simple yes or no question. Did you like how Ratchet & Clank Into the Nexus played? If yes, you'll like Ratchet 2016 a whole lot. If not, then I think you should try Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart instead. Okay, so Ratchet & Clank 2016 takes away pretty much the frustration of the original game by there simply being a strafe button, but then if you've also played Into the Nexus as I did when I was playing 2016 at the same time, it will feel awfully familiar. For one, most of the weapons are retooling of previous weapons from earlier Ratchet & Clank games. There are some new weapons, such as the Pixelizer and Proton Drum, which are fun to utilize but lose effectiveness over the course of the game, to be certain, which is not something that's a new problem to Ratchet & Clank games. Even the original game had this problem, sort of, starting with Ratchet & Clank 2 going commando. All the other weapons come primarily from the future series of Ratchet & Clank games, but there are some representations of the older games, such as the Glove of Doom and the Blaster. Weapons can be upgraded with Raritanium that drop from enemies and can be found in clusters in a level sometimes when scavenging around. And similar to the Into the Nexus handling of Raritanium, more slot upgrades become available as weapons level up through usage. Ratchet's health also increases after dealing enough damage to enemies over time, and thus makes it easier to deal with tougher enemies later in the game. But the lack of stronger armor, or armor in general, in Ratchet & Clank 2016 means that the game's enemies just do set amount of damage, and near the end of the game, you're gonna have to strafe and double jump strafe a lot in order to survive. As for the environments, some levels are straight copies from the original game. Word for word, position of everything is the same, with challenges to them being specific as well, but other levels are changed dramatically. For example, the Blarg station in Nebula G34, the Alien Queen has been replaced with a Blargian Snagglebeast as a boss, thus getting rid of Umbrus's boss and putting it inside of Nebula G34. Meanwhile, Gaspar has been massively overhauled to add a free-roaming collectible area where you collect Telepathopus brains, similar to how one would collect Gargathon horns in the previous game of Into the Nexus. Another new collectible in Ratchet & Clank 2016 are trading cards. These cards can be found in packs around the overworld or can be dropped by enemies upon killing them. Furthermore, card spawn rates can be increased by killing enemies with certain weapons after upgrading them with Raritanium, and duplicate cards can be traded in for regular cards you do not have after 5 duplicate cards have been acquired. This is a mechanic I actually was very ambivalent towards on my first playthrough of Ratchet 2016, but on subsequent playthroughs I will admit that I do enjoy the card mechanic. Completing a set of cards results in Ratchet getting a permanent buff to either damage, bolt drop amounts, Raritanium drop amounts, or card drop amounts, with other ones for weapons resulting in the Omega class weapons being unlocked in challenge mode, which returns once again. The cards as well are references to past Ratchet & Clank games, characters, and locations, which is a nice touch, I have to admit. Then there's the special Rhino cards. Unlike regular trading cards, the Rhino cards are put in one location in each level, and upon collecting all the cards, the player can obtain the titular Rhino weapon, based off the Future Series' Rhino design, from someone a little bit shady in Blackwater City. This makes it that, unlike the original game where the Rhino could be obtained after grinding bolts for hours on end, the Ratchet & Clank's 2016 Rhino is limited only to the absolute end of the game as a whole, which is kind of a shame, but then again, like the original Rhino, the Rhino in Ratchet 2016 makes every enemy absolutely pathetic, even on the highest difficulty, and especially the final boss. Other collectibles are the returning golden bolts hidden in each level that eventually unlock the Insomniac Museum, placed in somewhat familiar locations as the original, with some slight variations and twists of them throughout the game. And a collection of Ratchet & Clank memorabilia and a location that you can look at, known as the Insomniac Museum, unlocks upon getting all 28 gold bolts and completing a challenge mode playthrough, or at least starting a challenge mode playthrough, I should say. Although this Insomniac Museum is different from previous ones where development history was detailed, in Ratchet & Clank 2016's Insomniac Museum It is mainly a collection of the items and promotional arts from the previous games, as well as set up in the style of a storage unit, which is a nice little touch, I have to admit. As for Clank, he has brief gameplay stints that break up the action of the game, much like how it was in the original. Small puzzle sections reminiscent of the previous Ratchet & Clank games, mainly around Ratchet & Clank 1 and Going Commando. These are very brief and only happen about 3 to 4 times in the game, including a boss that Clank deals with in the most anticlimactic way possible. Ship combat from the first game makes its return, but much like the Clank sections, is also very limited and only shows up in a few instances throughout the entire game, so you might as well question why they even put it in there. But if I'm being honest, the entire game for Ratchet & Clank 2016 is rather short. It was a budget title after all, and I clocked in around 8 hours on my first playthrough, and that was just getting pretty much everything in the game, which it's not that bad, and honestly, shorter games aren't a bad thing by any stretch of the imagination. Since that can be sort of a thing that some people will take issue with and other people won't, I'll leave that up to you to decide if the short length of Ratchet & Clank 2016 is really worth it. But seeing as how the game is extremely discounted this day and age, and the fact that it was given away free for PlayStation Plus users to keep entirely, even if your subscription runs out a few months ago, I don't see much of an issue with it. The backgrounds and landscapes, while smaller in scope and scale, are still breathtaking and flow very nicely, even when the characters themselves do not. Frame rate on the PlayStation 4 was locked at 30 frames per second, but recently on the PlayStation 5, the game was bumped up to 60 frames per second, and never drops even with large explosions or amounts of enemies on the field dying. This is something that I love seeing with a generational upgrade. We had something similar back in the day when the PlayStation 2 would play PlayStation 3 games and you would get a graphics smoothing option. In this case, we get a frame rate buff, which is very nice. There isn't much for me to really mention though about the fact on the frame rate, other than even at 30 frames per second, it was more than playable and felt very fluid and nice. After all, Ratchet & Clank games weren't 60 frames per second for the longest time since Ratchet & Clank Future, A Crack in Time anyway, so for long-time series veterans like myself, the upgraded frame rate on the PlayStation 5 was a nice little surprise. Now, really, there isn't much more for me to mention with the gameplay of Ratchet 2016, except that it plays exactly the same as Into the Nexus did 3 years prior on a simple standard gameplay level. So, on that note, we'll get into the music and voice performances of Ratchet 2016. Does it live up to the original? Well... So on the music front, this time we have Ratchet & Clank All for One and Full Frontal Assault composer Michael Bross. Bross went for a more bombastic score that would match that of the movie theaters, but seeing as I'm a person who still uses stereo for his games, that unfortunately doesn't really have much of an effect on me. I didn't outright dislike Bross's compositions for Ratchet 2016. There were some nice tracks here and there, but I will be honest that they are a far cry from the memorable tracks that David Bergeau had made for the franchise, especially the first game. This shift in focus in soundtrack started really after Ratchet & Clank Future Quest for Booty, and honestly, none of the soundtracks in Ratchet games since Bergeau left the franchise have really impressed me that much. So I wasn't expecting Ratchet 2016 soundtrack to blow me away by any stretch of the imagination. I was expecting at least some remixes and some nods to the original game, but I didn't get any of those either, so I feel rather saddened by that. Maybe Bergeau has a copyright on the music for Ratchet & Clank, but it's hard to say. Either way, the music was definitely not a highlight of the game for me. As for the voice acting, it's hit or miss with some of the characters. Returning characters all sound great, with standout performances once again being Captain Quark by Jim Ward, this being the last video game Jim Ward will be voicing Captain Quark in. Ratchet being voiced by James Arnold Taylor, who has voiced Ratchet since Ratchet & Clank 2 Going Commando. Clank returning as David K, and finally Armin Shimmerman as Dr. Nefarious, always giving a very nice role for the good doctor. All the other performances are okay, but the ones that really caught me off guard were the performances of some of the A-list actors. Bella Thorne, for example, as Cora, one of the Galactic Rangers, honestly does not sound too enthusiastic being in the game, and it kind of shows in the performance, at least the takes that they used. Chairman Drek is no longer voiced by Kevin Michael Richardson, which is a real shame, but is instead voiced by Paul Giamatti. Giamatti does a good comedic Drek role, but I would have loved Kevin Michael Richardson reprising his role as Chairman Drek, considering that Kevin Michael Richardson is also no stranger to comedic roles of evil tyrants. I'm looking at you, Ben 10. Side characters all were voiced by big celebrities as well, such as John Goodman voicing Grim, the caretaker of Ratchet at the beginning of the game, and even Sylvester Stallone voicing Victor Von Ion in the movie, but was replaced by Neil Flynn in the game instead, which kind of just shows they were trying to bank on some of the big name voice actors to sell the movie rather than the movie sell itself. It's honestly a bigger problem too with voice actors being passed over for bigger celebrities to bring more attention to a movie or game, and it's a tactic that doesn't necessarily work in the Ratchet & Clank movies case, but did somewhat for the game? I'll leave that up to interpretation, but overall, wasn't too thrilled with the voice acting performances from anyone other than the main cast.
Ready, pal? Always. Hey, you coming?
Absolutely.
So overall, what are my thoughts on Ratchet & Clank 2016? Honestly, if it weren't for the gameplay being basically a prettier version of Into the Nexus, I honestly don't think I'd be as receptive to the game as I am currently being right now. The gameplay really carries this game, and I feel as a longtime fan of the Ratchet & Clank franchise, I show my bias in that. But for newcomers, this is a cheap, effective, and very good way of getting into the Ratchet & Clank series, instead of having to track down PS2 copies, the PlayStation 3, HD collection, or playing on emulators, which there are still problems with Ratchet & Clank games on emulators to this day. I honestly don't really see any reason for me to come back to Ratchet & Clank 2016 after this review though. At the time of this review, I have played through the game about 4 times. I have gotten every single trophy. I've gotten the platinum. I have gotten every single thing located within the game. I've even gotten all the Insomniac Museum explored. And honestly, I think that's enough. This might be just a 2 and done game for me. Well, I say 2 and done, but I did play it 4 times in a row to get every single trophy, so there is that. But hey, if you like this game, then more power to you. Just because I'm not the biggest fan of it doesn't mean it's a bad game. It's not my favorite in the franchise, but it's certainly far from being my least favorite in the franchise. That still goes to Full Frontal Assault and Secret Agent Clank. But either way, I can say Ratchet & Clank 2016 is a game that I kind of forget about over time, only to be reminded that it exists every once in a while, and especially since the main story is now continuing after Rift Apart, I don't really see the movie universe taking too much time, other than maybe a Ratchet & Clank cartoon that might be in the works. I don't know, we still don't know too much about that. But anyway, guys, I'm going to end it off right here. This has been Neronium, and I thank you all for watching my review of Ratchet & Clank 2016. Stay tuned for the eventual return to the Ratchet & Clank universe with the sequel to the original game, Ratchet & Clank 2, Going Commando. But until then, I'll see you all next time.